Our guest tonight is John Blatt. John, welcome to Dogman Encounters Radio. Thanks so much for coming.
Oh, thanks, Vic. Thanks for having me on.
For starters, John, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
I was born in suburbs of Chicago, and until about the age of 8, moved to Ohio for most of my childhood until I left for the Air Force at the age of 20. And through a course of life and many other interesting things, I ended up in the Pacific Northwest, and I love it here. I've always wanted to live up in the Pacific Northwest, and mostly because of my interest in Sasquatch. I've been here for about 8 years now, and one of the things that I'm very passionate about is primitive skills. I love to spend a lot of time in the wilderness and practice what they call bushcrafting or primitive skills, basically going to the woods with nothing. Of course, I go in with my clothes and everything else, but I like to try to live as naturally as I can when I'm in the forest. It's my sanctuary. I'm a fairly spiritual person, so I really love to go into the woods and feel at home there. That's where I'm at.
Let me ask you this, John. When you were small, your mother shared a very interesting story with you about a friend who told her about an incident or a series of incidents that he experienced involving a baby's cry. Could you share that story with us?
Sure. When I was around the age of 10 or 11, my mother used to do house cleaning for people, and one of the places that she got hired to do cleaning for was this house out in the country, pretty far away from any town. She became friends with the owner of the house, and one day during the course of conversation, the owner told her an experience that was passed down in their family when the house was first built back in the mid-1800s. At the time, it was fully forested area. Now, a lot of it is farmland out there, but when their great-great-grandfather, who first owned the house and had a family there, told a story and passed it down through generations of an experience that they had one night. The father was married and had some children. The father had gone into work in town and would get dropped off at the beginning of the driveway. The driveway would go down about a couple hundred yards. I've been out there before when I was a boy. So it would be a decent walk at night to walk a couple hundred yards through the forest to your house. And the story that was relayed to my mom, and she relayed that to me, was that he was dropped off at this road. It was the practice every night, I guess, when he was working. As he was walking down the dirt road to his home, he heard a baby cry in the forest. Kind of far away, but enough where he could make out that it was a baby cry. And he at first was very concerned because he had a baby of his own at the time. So he at first wanted to go into the woods, but it's like he didn't have any light source, and going into the woods in the middle of the night didn't make any sense to him. But he was still fairly concerned, but he kept walking, and the sound would happen, and then it would be silent for a while, and as he continued walking, he heard the sound again, and it sounded a little closer. And then he continued to walk, and as he continued down the driveway, the baby cry kept getting closer and closer to where he was. As he was walking in, he started to pick up the pace. You know, he didn't really know what to think about it. He was upset because the possibility it could be his own child in the forest in the middle of the night crying. And he didn't have any answers, of course, since he was experiencing this, not being with his family. And as he got near the end of the driveway or the road to his house, it curves to the right, and then there's a big farmhouse there. And as he made the turn around the bend there, the sound came right up to the edge of the forest. And he had this overwhelming sense that he needed to go into the forest to the sound of the baby crying. And he started walking towards the sound, and he stopped himself, and he just knew that it didn't make any possible sense that it could be his child. An infant child can't walk through the woods in the middle of the night, and cover the distance that it did. So logically, he knew that it couldn't be his child. He got quite afraid at that point and started running to his house, and he ran up on the porch, went through the door, shut the door, and locked it. Almost immediately after he locked the door and was standing in disbelief of what had just happened to him, he heard footsteps come up onto the porch, and the doorknob moved, and like it was trying to open up the door to come in, whatever it was. And then he could hear the footsteps leaving the porch. And then shortly after that, from the back of the house where they had kept quite a bit of livestock, knew that they had chickens and I believe some goats. I think even they had a cow or two. And they heard these horrible screams, cries and wails, and they didn't know what to think. And they could hear the animals being destroyed in the back of the house. Horrible sounds that came from out back. And the next morning, I don't know if they got much rest or not after that experience, but in the morning, after the sun came up, they went outside and all their livestock had been destroyed. A normal predator would go after one chicken or goat, then eat it. It didn't look like that was the case, that everything had been torn apart, almost like it was upset that it didn't get what it wanted. I'll always remember when my mom relayed that story to me. If you knew my mom, she didn't like anything like that. She wasn't into any of these scary stories or scary movies or anything that had to do with the paranormal or anything like that. So she wasn't too fond necessarily of wanting to tell it, but she did tell it to my sister and I, and of course I never forgot it. And I don't think I ever will.
Oh, I don't think I'm ever going to forget that story either. If I'm ever out in the woods again, John, and I hear a baby crying, guess what I'm going to think about? And also, too, for the listeners, I know I'm going to get more emails on this, but yes, dogmen do jiggle doorknobs and try to manipulate them to try and get into structures. I hate to say that, like I said, I'm probably going to get a lot of emails on that, but it's true. That story about the baby cry sound, that does tie into something that John's going to share with us later on in the show, but that's down the road. Before we leave the topic of your childhood, John, I want to ask you about your beliefs when you were young. Were you into Bigfoot? Did you read up on them, or did you not really care much about them?
My early years, I guess I was like any normal kid. I wasn't really exposed to anything, at least in my family, I wasn't really exposed to anything strange or paranormal or anything along those kind of lines. But it wasn't until I had my own experience at the age of 7 that kind of impacted me for the rest of my life. And after that experience, that changed. I would do a lot of my own research and study and reading as much as I could on those subject. So,
John, you mentioned the encounter that you had when you were 7, the encounter that basically set the table for you and the subsequent encounters that you were to have later on through the course of your life with other cryptids. Could you tell us about that encounter that started everything off?
Sure, no problem. When I was 7 years old, I went on a field trip with my school to one of the nature preserves in the general area outside of Chicago, and I remember it being very woodsy. There was a lot of wildlife, and I remember there being like it's a swampy area. And I remember a lot of that time of my life is kind of fuzzy. You know, back when you're 7 years old, at least at this point in my life, I don't really have a whole lot of details of recollections except of the story that we're about to embark on here. When I was 7 years old, we were walking down this trail in the woods, and I remember being in the back of the class on this trail. This is really the first time I had ever experienced that. I remember looking to my right down at the ground and seeing a little turtle. Well, I got totally engrossed in this turtle that was on the ground to my right, and as any little boy would, I did not notice that the rest of my class had continued on down the trail without me, and I'm not quite sure how much time had passed by. I think at least enough to where it was probably a few minutes. I remember standing up and looking around and thinking, oh, I'm by myself. As soon as I stood up and looked down the trail, about 25 to 30 feet away was a giant hairy monster. I really remember being just in shock at what it was I was looking at. I didn't know what I was looking at because I had never experienced anything even in the ballpark of as a seven-year-old boy, anything like that. And I remember it. I could not see its face. The hair had come over its face. It wasn't as muscular as some other Sasquatch encounters are. You know, they tend to be some of them very large and muscular. But this didn't seem to be that way. It was fairly skinny. But to me, it was a giant too. I was looking up at it, and I remember it gently swayed its arms as it was moving back and forth, and then it let out this wail, like a cry. Not like a baby cry, but like some of the Sasquatch sounds that you can hear on the internet. It was so loud. I remember feeling it in my chest. And the next thing I remember after that, that I was being carried by my teacher, and there were a couple other adults that were around me as we were walking down the trail. So the time the Sasquatch had let out this wail to the time that I was being carried down the trail by these adults, I have no recollection of. I don't know what happened. All I remember is that I was very upset. I was crying, something that I don't really necessarily enjoy talking about, but as a little boy, it was quite embarrassing that I had soiled myself. And I remember the teacher was upset with me that I had run off, and that then on top of it I had soiled myself on top of it. And I was just in a terrible state, of embarrassment, of having that experience and of soiling myself, but also of having this encounter. And I remember trying to explain to the adults that I had just seen a hairy monster, and that went just, nobody paid attention to that at all. I was just making up a story to them. other than those details, I don't really remember a whole lot. I wish I could say that I know more specific details about that experience, but other than those things, I really would like to maybe at some point even do a hypnotic regression to know what happened during that time where I don't have any memory. But that is kind of what started me down this path almost forced me down this path in many ways, of becoming a Sasquatch researcher and being very open to anything and everything that has to do with the unexplained and the mysterious in this life.
One last thing I want to touch on, John, before we leave the childhood segment of discussion. You said that you had night terrors as a result of that encounter.
Yeah, I sure did. For most of my childhood, even into my teen years, I had night terrors, and it didn't happen every night, but I would have these recurring nightmares of what I called, especially when I was younger, I had called the siren monster. Because that's the kind of the noise that it made, like an ambulance siren would make. And I remember being very afraid at night sometimes while lying in bed, and especially when I would hear sirens. If you live in a city, you would hear sirens every once in a while at night. Lying in bed and hearing the sirens, I was so afraid because I was sure that the siren monster was like coming for me. I remember being scared, imagining it coming up the stairs, into my room at night. But I did have ongoing night terrors about hairy monsters. And I really didn't understand what that was all about. My parents didn't either. They didn't know what to think about it all. I didn't have anything like that before this experience. And it wasn't really until I was about, I think it might have been even the next year. I remember being 8, right before we moved to Ohio. We moved to Ohio when I was 8. I remember one of my parents had gotten a Reader's Digest book on unexplained mysteries. And I remember coming across the Bigfoot section in that book, and I was just stunned when there was remember someone had drawn a sketch of a Sasquatch, but it looked exactly like what I had seen in the forest, when I had that encounter. And I realized that it was a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot, as was more the term back then. And, ever since then, I remember trying to pretend to be a Sasquatch hunter when I was a little boy, walking around the neighborhood looking for Sasquatch tracks. And, maybe it was my way of trying to cope with this experience that I had, instead of forcing it away and trying to ignore it. I think maybe I did try to do that, but my recurring nightmares would always kind of bring it up. At some point, I don't remember when it was, but at some point I just put it into my mind that I was just going to figure this out, and I was going to face it. Maybe it was conversation with my mom. That I remember a brief conversation when I was younger that she said, if you're afraid of something, sometimes the best thing to do is to face it, and it will go away. So, in my own way, I did everything I could to face it, to read as much as I could, and I remember the day that I watched The Legend of Boggy Creek. That did not help anything at all. As a little boy, watching, especially after my experience, I was just like, oh man, I did not necessarily, it was fascinating to see that. Of course, that film was very fascinating still remember being so scared after that for weeks. Anytime it would come on after that, it was like, no, I can't. I'm not going to watch The Legend of Boggy Creek again. But I did, I really did try to read everything I could back then, living in a small town, having a small library. There wasn't a whole lot of books available, but I did what I could, and when I got older, I branched out more and tried to read, get magazine subscriptions, and do as much research as I could.
John, considering the fact that you were only 7 when you had that encounter, when you're that young, it's awfully difficult to deal with stressful situations like that in your life. I know you really went through it, but it could have been a lot worse. It showed a lot of constitution to bounce back the way that you did. Now, moving forward, I want to talk about the Dogman encounter you had. But before you talk about that actual encounter and what you saw, lead us up to that encounter by telling us about why you were out there in the woods that day in the first place.
Sure. Well, at the time, I had just gone through a breakup with my girlfriend at the time. I was pretty sad. I was pretty broken up inside, and as I tend to do, especially if I'm going through something difficult in my life, especially emotionally, really the only place where I go to get solace for my ills is the forest. I love nature so much, and it's like my real home, I feel, in many ways. I live in a town most of the time, so I don't have direct access to be able to go out into the forest or into the woods. But when I'm able to, I do. When I was going through this difficult time, I went out to one of the state parks here, that not too far away, and I went down one of the trails. And one of the habits that I tend to do is I'll go down the trail to a certain point, and when nobody else is around, I'll take a sharp turn and go off trail, and I'll go off trail quite a ways, not too terribly far where I could possibly get lost, but enough to be far enough away where I'm not going to be interrupted, or there's, someone who will walk by on the trail, that I'm truly alone and secluded. I really enjoy that feeling when I'm in the woods, and this case was no different. So it was probably I would say maybe about 100 yards off trail. Not too mountainous. I mean, it was hilly, of course, but the particular state park, off the top of my head, I wish I remembered the name of it, but went off trail at this park, and I went out to this area, and usually I just keep going until I feel like I've reached an area that's just untouched by man, that there isn't any logging or trees that have been cut down or anything like that. I like to be in an area where there isn't anything like that. This particular area that I got to this day, I was very familiar with the trails there, so I knew that there were no trails to the north of my location, because I had traveled north off the trail. And now the area, which is a beautiful, pristine Pacific Northwest forest view, if you can imagine. Beautiful ferns all over the ground, trees, foliage that had come down from the Douglas fir trees that are all around, and there was a large tree that had come down at some point, and I had kind of set up a little, not a camp, but, I put down my backpack and my knife and everything, and kind of got myself situated, because I wanted to start a video blog. That day was going to be my first video blog. I had just gotten a new smartphone and had a nice camera on it, and I wanted to experiment with starting videos. And I thought this would be a good time just to kind of share my heart and kind of share what I was going through at the moment. as I started my video, and you're able to look at yourself on the phone while you're making the video, so you can see what you look like. Kind of strange, but I remember going into the circumstances of where my heart was at during that time. And after about 5 minutes of talking, I had heard, was kind of surprised by this, but I heard a baby cry to the northwest of my location where I was sitting on this log. I'm like, I didn't really just hear that, I got up and I looked and didn't see any movement, didn't see anything unusual, and usually I'm very aware of my surroundings, and nothing seemed unusual to me. So I continued on with my video, because I really wasn't, my whole heart and soul was kind of coming out at this point, and I was sharing that on this video. And as I was talking, I heard the baby cry again. It was more distinct the second time, and I stopped. And at that point, my my antenna kind of went up. At that point, like, okay, what possibly could be going on here? If there's anything unusual, and I got up, I stood up on the log, and I looked at the location of where the sound came from, and there was nothing out of place. There was nothing really, strange at all. I stood there for a good minute, just kind of observing and taking everything in, and, I didn't really sense anything anything that was wrong at that point. But it was very unusual to hear something like that out there, knowing that there was no other trails or there were no other people around. So kind of very reluctantly, I started going back to my to my video and started talking again, and then I heard a noise further, kind of a little further to the north. The sounds I heard were coming from like the northwest, maybe it seemed to be about 60 to 70 feet away, and I heard more direct to my north. There was more of a hill, a little more pronounced hill. So I was kind of like down at the bottom of this hill, and I heard basically sounded like on the other side of this hill where it's kind of out of my view. I heard rustling of something kind of fairly large, an animal of some kind, of a movement, and that really kind of put me on edge at that point, since there were the three things happened that were kind of unusual. Sometimes, you do come across wildlife in the forest, and I'm not unaccustomed to that, but I know enough at this point, with all of the research that I've done, that that something could be afoot. So I got up and really tried, and I was using my camera too to pan and look to see, if I, as a Sasquatch researcher, if by chance hearing something like that, this would catch, one of the Sasquatch beings come out from behind a tree or something, and you got your camera going, that's golden right there, So I wasn't necessarily expecting that, but I didn't know what could be going on. I kind of just assumed it could just be an animal, a deer or something. But I didn't see anything. I didn't see any movement. But after standing there and being quiet for at least about 30 seconds after that movement, I noticed that all the sounds of the forest had gone quiet. And you could hear a pin drop. at that point, before that, there were birds chirping, that typical, but I noticed that there was a silence that came upon the area, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I knew at that point that something was happening. And that's a good indicator that I could be in trouble at that point. Because I'm fairly familiar with David Paulides' work, and people do go missing, especially up in the Pacific Northwest, and especially if you're alone, and especially if you go off trail. If these things are all, I am aware of those things, and I do it knowingly, but I walk, I seek to be as aware as I possibly can. I try to be prepared when I go out, but I'm not going to live my life in fear, because, if I was afraid I was going to go missing every time I go into the forest, I would never go into the forest. So I choose not to live that way. But having the forest go quiet like that, I've had it happen to me once before. Another an investigation I went on years prior, a Sasquatch investigation that I was on, the same thing happened to me then too, and I had an encounter then too. But it was a very eerie kind of calm that came over the area. So I was kind of on red alert at that point. But there was no movement. I didn't see anything. I had gotten my fairly large combat knife out, and I'm just ready, so as I could be, with my camera going and everything. And as I was looking at the top of this hill where I heard this movement come, I focused in on this point where I had thought I had seen, this point that how do I explain this? I guess I had noticed before. Either I had noticed before, or it had just appeared, and when my eyesight wasn't directly on that spot, and I had to take it. I remember after watching the video, I gasped, because what I was looking at, it looked just like a extremely large wolf was staring at me up on the top of the hill, and it was kind of this. It wasn't right out in the open, but it was like nestled in between the foliage, like the ferns and the bush, and I had to stop and say to myself, am I really seeing what I'm seeing? Is this a trunk of a tree, that a down tree, that can have odd shapes to it? I'm staring at, and I don't have 20/20 eyesight anymore. I wish I did. I don't wear glasses when I drive. I had fairly decent vision, but I don't have perfect vision anymore. So at this distance, which was about 60 to 70 feet away, were what I was looking at, this space, for lack of better terms, it looked just like a large wolf head staring at me with its mouth slightly open, and I could see not a whole lot of teeth, but I could see that the main canine teeth sticking out. And I remember saying to myself, and I've had this on video, and I'm trying to focus in on my phone. And I'm like, I gotta get this, And when you zoom in on one of these phones, the digital zoom, it kind of makes everything kind of distorted. So I don't think I really was able to get anything really well with the phone, but I was just, with my own vision, I was looking at, like, I'm not really seeing this, am I? And it's like, I got to the point where it hadn't moved at all for about a minute, and the thought crossed my mind, like, maybe I should go up the hill and to really check, because it's not moving at all. And then, as soon as I thought that, I saw movement of what looked like a tongue come out of its mouth. The stereotypical, like, licking the chops, kind of, where the tongue would go across the outside of the upper part of the jaw. And at that point, I almost dropped my phone, and I was like, oh crap, I gotta get out of here. You know, my first thought, of course, you know, I'm a father. My first thought was that I gotta get back to my son. You know, at that point, I thought, if I really am looking at a dog man, I'm in serious trouble. And I was kind of borderline whether or not I really, at that point, really knew, if they existed or not. I mean, people do see all kinds of interesting cryptids throughout the world, and I'm very aware of that. But I never thought that I might ever come across something like that. But at that moment, it was like a shiver went down my spine, and like, I have to get out. I have to, like, the fight or flight kind of response. And of course, it was the flight response. And I have my video going, and I'm talking and trying to communicate what's going on, and at that point, I'm talking to what it is I'm seeing. I'm like, okay, I'm leaving, you know, just chill out, don't come after me, you know. I'm talking like this to it, you know, trying to almost kind of make the situation lighthearted, you know, because I would not be surprised if it could feel my fear, if it was what I was really seeing. If I had a really strong fear response, that might not be something that would be a good thing for me. So I'm trying to make the very serious and scary situation more kind of like lighthearted, and I'm communicating with it, and I get down and I'm picking up my backpack, and you know, and I got my knife in my hand, and I'm walking backwards, trying to not trip over the foliage and so forth, and I'm keeping my eye and the camera on that area, because if it started moving, at least if I disappeared, maybe the camera would get it before it got me. And if there was a search found for me, you know, a search for me, they might be able to recover my phone or something, you know. Those things, all those little thoughts came zipping through my mind, you know, as I'm trying to get out. And I really wanted to just run. I wanted to run as fast as I could, but I knew that if I did that, if it really was a dog man, if I really was seeing what I was seeing, that would be the worst response that I could probably do, especially being alone and off trail like that. And as soon as I was able to get down to a point where I was no longer in direct eyesight of that I couldn't see it, so that it couldn't see me, hopefully, I picked up my pace as much as I could without making it sound like I was running. You know, the last thing I wanted to do is to make it seem like I was fleeing because it might have a pursuit response, you know. So I continued that way and really panning my whole area around me, both my own eyes and the camera, because I know at this point, with the knowledge that I have, that if there really is one, there very well and very possibly would be a second or more in the area. And I kept that in mind as I was trying to get out of the forest and trying to get back to the main trail. So ultimately, I got back. I was coming down the hill. I could see the trail in front of me, and thankfully, there were a couple people who were coming down the trail at the same time as I was coming down this hill. And I was so relieved, and just to be with someone, to be around other people after that experience. And the thought did come into my mind, and I'm kind of almost ashamed to think of it, but I thought, like, well, if this thing really does come after me, at least I have someone else in front of me to kind of throw him in the way, you know, or something. Self-preservation kind of just kicks in at that point, you know. But, you know, I was really thankful to get out of that and, to get back on the trail and walk out and get into my car and breathe a huge sigh of relief and I had to go back over the whole video of that experience, and I tell you, it was something I'll certainly never forget. And after that, that's when I really kind of like, okay, I need to know more about dogmen. I remember getting on Facebook and getting to be a part of your group, Vic, and then seeing and listening to dogman encounters and hearing other people's first-hand encounters and reading some of the stories and hearing some of the interviews. It's like, oh man, you know, my experience, if it was very mild compared to some of the others that have had first-hand encounters with these beings. But I felt something. One of the things that I'm a fairly empathic person. A lot of my friends would call me psychic, but I don't necessarily like to use that term, but I do have a sixth sense about me, and I've used that gift over the years. It saved my butt many times in the past, but I remember when I saw what I saw up on the hill, my sixth sense screamed to me, you've got to get out. It wasn't just a natural fight or flight response to something that you think you saw, but there was more to it. It's like there was a deeper warning that came. I don't know if it was necessarily a communication, a telepathic communication from it that was telling me to get out of its territory, that I was in its territory or what, but there was definitely something else there that told me that I had to leave and I needed to get out as soon as I could. And that could just be, my own gut reaction to the experience, but I really do feel that my intuition gave me a strong warning on top of that. So, which gives it, to me, a little more credence. Because I've seen things before, but my intuition hasn't kicked off like that. And so I don't give some of those, when that doesn't happen for me, when my intuition doesn't kick in and really speak to me about a situation, it's usually pretty accurate. But in this situation, it really spoke to me very loud and clear. And I know research about with Sasquatch, people have it's not just a normal fear response. It's like there's something deeper fear that comes. Almost, maybe some people would like to say it's a paranormal induced fear. And maybe that was part of that. I'm not 100% sure, but it was something that I'm not going to forget for quite a while. And especially now when I go out into the woods, and I still do. I won't go back to that area where I was before, I'm not going to do that, but I can't, if it wanted me, I wouldn't be here right now. I'm convinced, if it wanted to get me, as pretty much almost any of the encounters that people have with these kind of beings, that they're so powerful and until I would imagine so very dangerous, that if they really put it in their mind that you're their next meal or whatever it might be, the reason behind their attack, if they really wanted to attack, you really wouldn't stand a chance. I mean, that's my opinion. I could be wrong, but I think that these beings are, if you see them and you walk away in some way, shape, or form with your life, and you don't end up disappearing, they let you go. That's my opinion.
Oh, I'd say you're right. There's no doubt about that. When you look at how well equipped they are to kill even larger animals, it would be a situation where they decided to let you go, if that is in fact what happened. I'm a little fuzzy on something with regards to your encounter there, John. Did you at any point ever see that dogman's body or only its head?
I just saw its head. I didn't see anything else besides the face that was looking directly at me.
Was its head in a position where it had to be in an upright position, standing on two legs watching you? Or could that have possibly been a huge timber wolf, even though you don't have any timber wolves out in that area?
Well, it looked like it was closer to the ground. It didn't look like, at least from the perspective where I was, it looked much closer to the ground. It didn't look like it was high above the ground. Like if it was a dogman or a timber wolf, it was on all fours probably. Almost the kind of impression I got that it was sneaking up. Sneaking up to see me, and that kind of was the impression I got. So when I saw it, I had a double take, like I was looking at scanning that whole particular area, because that's where I heard the rustling of the sound at first, and at one point I didn't see that, and then at another point I did see it. So I don't know. It's like it snuck up, or peeked its head out maybe when I just wasn't looking at that direct spot. I don't know.
Understand too, John, that dogmen can look just like a massive timber wolf when they go down on all fours. So, considering the fact that there aren't any timber wolves in that area, you just might have been looking at a dogman, especially when you consider the size of its head that you were talking about seeing. As part of the after effects of that encounter, you had an interesting thing happen with the video that you recorded of that incident. Could you share the particulars of that with us?
Well, after I had that experience, I got into my car and I watched that whole video several times. I did upload it to my YouTube channel, and I had a few friends watch it, and they couldn't see anything when I zoomed in with the camera, they all got distorted. But what was all very clear was my own reactions to it. And one of my friends, after watching the video, he was like, man, that kind of reminded me of the Blair Witch Project, you know. He was just like, what? You know, the kind of reaction that I had to it and the kind of feel that the video had was like that. And I had it on my channel for probably, I didn't have it on public, you know, I had it unlisted because it was a private video, and it wasn't something that I was experimenting with doing a video blog, and so it was kind of personal, and it was just something that I just wasn't going to try to promote, you know, especially since I couldn't really make out what it was that I was seeing on the video. But after I started doing research and so forth on the Dogman and getting part of your group and so forth, and remember there was a post that had come up on your group, and I remember commenting, it's like, you know, I had an experience of a Dogman, and, you know, I even have a video about it. And they were like, oh, you know, a couple of people on the post were like, oh, share it, please, you know. So I'm like, oh, sure. So I go to my channel, and it's not there. And I'm like, what? You know, I have a couple channels. So I went, you know, I put on the wrong channel, so I went and checked out all my channels, and it wasn't there. And I'm like, that's crazy. Why wouldn't it be there? So I go, I'm going to upload it again, you know. Maybe YouTube took it down for some reason. I don't know. But I didn't get any indications, you know, that there was anything wrong with it. So I go onto my phone to upload it again, and it's gone. You know, my first thought was like, well, the government hacked my phone and took it, took my picture, you know, my video of the Dogman, you know, but, you know, I don't know what happened to it. It sounds crazy. It sounds like a tinfoil hat moment, you know. But I tell you, I don't have an explanation for why I don't have it anymore. And I know the stereotypical response. I mean, I've been in the Sasquatch research community for a long time, and I know that the typical response to something like that, if that happened to somebody else, oh, I got it on video, but oh, the government took it, or, you know, somebody comes out with that kind of a response, like, oh, right, yeah, you really did, huh? You know, so I'm kind of like cynical about it at this point, where I know that I did it, I know it happened to me, I don't have an explanation for why I don't have it anymore. And I wish I did have it. I know that the capability of being able to go on a device like a smartphone and remove something like that, I know it's possible. I know it can be done. You just wouldn't ever think that it would be that video. Why would they go through the trouble? Didn't really even show anything. But still, it disappeared. And I don't really have a rational explanation for it.
That is awfully strange. It sure sounds like you met with some kind of foul play, but like you said, we never will know what really happened to that video. It's a shame, because it sounds like it would have been awfully interesting to watch. Well, John, it's time to wrap the show up. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
I do want to say thank you, Vic, for the kind of work that you do. You know, to put yourself out like you are, to have a podcast, a website, and to do interviews like this, you're really putting yourself out there, and you're really doing great work, in my opinion. And I've seen a lot of people, especially in the Sasquatch community, do that. They put themselves out there, and they really want to be a voice in the community and so forth. And I've had friends who have been attacked, and, you know, it's not pleasant. It's a lot of times when you put especially something like Bigfoot or Dogman. Dogman, I mean, that's a crazy subject, and open to a huge amount of ridicule and things like that. I just want to tip my hat to you, Vic, because for me, if you weren't doing what you were doing, there would be a lot of people who wouldn't be able to tell their story. And I think this is important. I think it's a huge mystery that needs to be looked at and examined. I think you're doing a great job of doing it from all the stuff that you've been putting out.
Well, thank you for the good words there, John. I really do appreciate it. Don't feel too bad for me when you love what you do the way that I love doing this. It doesn't really matter if you have naysayers that don't agree with what you say or do. It's really no big deal or consequence to me. But I really want to thank you again for coming on the show. I really do appreciate your time.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again. Well, as you know, don't be a stranger, okay?
Okay, you got it.
I appreciate it. Well, have a great night.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. If you've had a Dogman encounter and you want to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, you can reach me at contact@dogmanencounters.com. I'd love to hear from you. I wanted to read some encounters for you that I recently posted on dogmanencounters.com. The first encounter occurred in Louisiana in Jefferson Parish, and it reads, "My encounter happened a few years ago in South Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. Here in Louisiana, we call counties parishes, in case you didn't know. I was hunting deer or wild pigs one night on a protection levee system that was built to protect the town from hurricane floodwaters. As I walked to where the levee turns off to the left, there was a canal woods that was about 100 yards from some houses. To the left was a natural ridge that goes out into the swamps and marshes. Well, as I made that turn from the ridge of oak trees, I heard a growl. I thought it might have been a coyote or a dog, so I walked slower. Then I heard brush and a smaller-sized tree shake and another growl. I shined my light in the direction of the sound and saw a pair of eyes that were reflecting an amber-yellow color. What surprised me was the fact that the brush was about 6 foot high and the eyes were about a foot above the brush. When I saw those eyes, I slowly backed up while keeping my light on the thing. As I walked back to the turn to head back to my truck, which was parked about 3/4 of a mile away, it came out of the woods. I lit the thing up with my light again. Now I was probably 30 feet from it. I saw its whole body and face. The body was covered with black hair with some brown mixed in. The hair was thickest around its head, neck, chest, and upper back. It looked a lot like a lion's mane, but wasn't as pronounced since all of the hair was the same color. It had pointy ears with a little bit of hair coming off the points, making the ears seem a little longer. It stood on 2 legs, but the legs were weird and backwards-like. The arms were really long, longer than the legs. Its hands were like a mixture of human and bear, like really big raccoon front paws. It had paws, but it also had fingers. That's the only way to describe it. If you watch the movie The Howling, you'll get an idea what this thing looked like. It's as if whoever made that movie knew something others didn't. Now at this point, I was freaking out, so I pulled up my rifle. I hunt with a Romanian AK with a camo paint job I did myself. The way I was hunting wasn't exactly legal, that's why I took my Romanian AK. If I had to toss it, I wouldn't be out much money. The rounds I use are special rounds made to hunt feral hogs. I've dropped deer and hogs with these rounds before. One shot and they're done. But back to the story. As I pulled my rifle up to the ready, it growled and walked a few steps toward me. I fired a round right into its chest area. I knew I had hit it because the creature took a step back. As it stepped back, I ran toward my truck. That's when it let out a loud growl and a howl like I had never heard before. I grew up hunting and fishing and thought I knew everything in the woods, but I hadn't heard anything like the sounds it made before. As I ran back to the truck, it stalked me, but kept its distance. As I got close to the well-lit area where my truck was parked by the town library and elementary school, it stopped following me. I tried to find anyone who may have had similar encounters in the area, but all I could find was old legends of the Rougarou. I told my grandpa about what had happened, but told him it was a friend who had told me it had happened to him. I also told him that it sounded like a crazy story to me. He told me when he was 17 in the same area at night hunting, he heard a howl like nothing he had ever heard before. He also told me that something had stalked him as he ran home that night. He said he never saw what it was, but could hear it following him through the brush and swamps. That encounter has changed my life. My perception of what is real and what is not will never be the same again. I still haven't gotten over that night. I went back a few days after that incident and found 2 large dog tracks as big as my hand. I wear a size large glove. Signed, Anonymous. Time, 2 a.m., November 17th, 2012. The next encounter I'm going to read to you occurred in Matanuska Valley County, Alaska. This encounter reads, My encounter took place many years ago. I never had the faintest explanation for it until a couple of months ago when I randomly stumbled across Dogman on the internet. I was in my early 20s working swing shifts at the time and commuting about 100 miles each way, so it was usually around 2 in the morning by the time I got home. I saw the monster, as I called it, on the northernmost section of Trunk Road in the Matanuska Valley in Alaska. This area is roughly smack in between the towns of Palmer and Wasilla. I was only about 10 miles from home at that point, so it must have been around 2 a.m. Trunk Road is a narrow 2-lane road consisting of nothing but twists and turns. The surrounding terrain is somewhat swampy and thick with black spruce. It was late October, days before Halloween. There was no snow on the ground, but it was cold enough to be wary of ice. I was driving an '82 Subaru SW going about 20 miles per hour around a curve when my headlights caught a large, dark figure up ahead. I'm bad at judging distance, maybe 6 car lengths away. I instinctively let off the gas, coasting closer. At first I assumed it was a moose, as the area is infested with them, but no, it was standing upright. Bear then? No, not a bear. It looked so strange. Tall enough to be an uncommonly large bear, but far too slender, and it looked like it had spikes running down its neck and back. A Halloween prop? Odd but effective place for one. All those thoughts ran through my head in a fraction of a second. The car was still coasting closer, and I could see more details. It was standing in profile, gazing across the road. I could clearly see its wolfish muzzle, large upright ears. The spikes on its back were in fact clumps of fur. Its spine curved in a smooth, very natural-looking way. It was standing in the ditch, inches from the pavement. Because I was focused on its upper body, I don't recall anything about its back legs or if it had a tail. I did see its front legs, though, very doggy-looking, hanging awkwardly down and slightly towards its front, exactly as you'd expect if a dog stood upright. It was perfectly still, and at this point, given the proximity to Halloween, I was quite convinced it was some sort of a Halloween prop because it was clearly not any kind of existing animal. I was deeply impressed and gently stepped on the brakes, intending to stop and examine it closely. Then it turned its head towards me. In the tiny fraction of a second that it took for it to swivel its head, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The fluidness of its movement removed any and all doubt that this was some kind of a prop. It was horribly, terrifyingly alive. The pale off-white glow of its eyeshine and the headlights destroyed any possibility of a human in a costume. I think I sat there gaping at it in shock for a few seconds, the car barely moving by now, but still inching closer. As I was almost upon it, I think it could have leaned forward and touched the car if it had wanted. I had to look up to see its face. Again, I'm a bad judge of things, but I'm 5'4", and it was a heck of a lot taller than me. Tall like a polar bear standing. 7 feet? 8? I I really can't say. I snapped out of my trance and slammed on the gas. The car fishtailed and I prepared myself for death by monster, as I was certain I'd end up in the ditch, but the tires caught the pavement and I drove like a complete maniac all the way home. I did not look back. I have only been on that section of road a few times since, never alone and never in the dark. For the next several years of driving that commute, I went 20+ miles out of the way to avoid Trunk Road. The thing never made any aggressive moves, but there was something about it that felt very, I don't know, predatory. I never saw anything remotely like it again and never heard any stories about it in the area. Signed, Melissa H. Time, 2 a.m., October 22nd, 1998. The third encounter I'm going to read to you tonight occurred in St. Louis County, Minnesota. The encounter reads, first off, I would like to keep my name confidential just for the fact that this happened on an Air Force base and I don't know who reads this stuff. This happened sometime in September of '99. I forget the exact date. It was early in the month though. It was between 2 and 3 a.m. I was a Security Forces airman working third shift on base patrol. Now mind you, this is an Air National Guard base that I worked at full-time. It's on the north side of Duluth, Minnesota, next to the International Airport. North to northeast is nothing but large wooded areas, forested areas. Third shift on the base was pretty boring, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and us full-timers worked a skeleton crew, usually only 5 to 6 of us on third shift. I was in the patrol truck doing my usual rounds, checking doors and fence lines. Late at night on the north side of the base was usually creepy enough when patrolling by yourself. Anyways, I was on this road driving towards our baseball field when my headlights caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. They were almost eye level with me and I was sitting in an F-150. Around this time, a few of the guys had been seeing this huge buck around the property, like a 16-pointer or something around that size. I was about 80 yards or so when I saw the eyes reflecting back at me, so I'm thinking it was a big deer. I gotta see this thing, so I hit the gas and started speeding towards the field. This is where it all happened so fast. It's almost hard to explain. There was a little slope behind the baseball field. It sloped down probably about 12 to 15 feet into a brush line. The brush went about 30 feet, then turned into a thick tree line. The brush was probably armpit high to me and pretty tough to traverse through, being so thick. As I turned into the baseball field and turned the truck towards the thing, I just caught the rear end of the thing leaping down the slope below the line of sight of my headlights. The thing was no more than about 20 feet ahead of me when it leaped. All I got to look at was the back end of the thing, and it was big. The best I can do to describe it is to say that it was wolf-dog-like in nature. It had a long tail, longer than 2 feet. The hind legs looked exactly like that of a dog's. Same with the back paws, but the paws were huge. They were bigger than my hands for sure. The hair fur was wavy yet matted and thick. The color was blondish or very light brown. I didn't notice any gray in it, but this all happened within 2 to 3 seconds. I sat in my patrol truck for a couple of seconds, confused and thinking, I know what I saw, but it couldn't have been what I saw. So I hopped out with my flashlight and M16 rifle and walked to the edge of the slope. All I heard was the thing running through the woods in front of me, heading in a northwest direction, and this thing sounded like a moose charging through the trees. It made a lot of noise. That's when I started to get really scared, thinking, if this is some sort of wolf or whatever it could be, my M16 isn't going to do a thing to this animal. So I jumped back into my patrol truck as fast as I could and headed back to the SF headquarters. I never told any of the other members about this for fear of ridicule or being called crazy. There's no way I misidentified this thing. I'm a trained observer, an avid hunter, and have worked with animal rehabilitation with the Minnesota DNR in the past. I know my animals in the North Woods extremely well. I saw exactly what I saw, and that was the back end of a large wolf dog thing, that basically had its eyes level with mine while I was in a patrol truck. The back end was definitely much larger than any of the largest deer or black bears I've seen. The points I remember the clearest were the tail and back paws, as well as the texture and color of the hair fur. This is my story. I've never told it to anyone in fear of ridicule. I swear it to be the truth. Signed, Anonymous. Early September of '99, 2:30 a.m. I'd like to thank all 3 eyewitnesses for submitting those reports. I appreciate it. If you'd like to read more encounters like these, go to dogmanencounters.com and visit the Encounters/Sightings page. There's one last thing I'd like to share with you before we bring tonight's guest on. If you'd like your own Dogman Encounters t-shirt, I still have XLs and larges in stock. To place your order, please visit dogmanencountersradio.com. Look on the homepage and you'll see an ordering link. Our guest tonight had a dogman encounter when he was 11 years old about a mile outside of the town of Gertie, Oklahoma. Mike, welcome to Dogman Encounters Radio. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks, Vic. I'm happy to be here.
Mike, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Yes, I'm 53 years old. I was born in southeastern Oklahoma, near where my encounter took place. I'm now living and working in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and have been for the last 25 years.
I see. You mentioned in the pre-interview that growing up, there were some areas around that were known for various sightings. To start things off, could you tell us about the sightings you had heard about in and around a place called Atwood, Oklahoma?
Yes. During the time that we lived in Gertie, we had always heard about creature sightings, and most of them came in an area around the South Canadian River near a town called Atwood, Oklahoma. There were never a lot of details, but people would talk about people witnessing some sort of creature, sometimes raiding gardens or apple trees in people's backyards and things like that. It happened quite often. It seemed like I heard a story once or twice a year during the first 11 years of my life.
Since you had your dogman encounter so early on in your life, had you heard about all this talk before you had that encounter with regards to cryptids in that Atwood area?
Yes, quite a bit, but I never did, we always just thought it was interesting stories, perhaps. I didn't really believe or disbelieve any of it. It was just the stories that people told were pretty interesting. It didn't affect anything that I did outdoors prior to my encounter.
So you had heard them, were open to the possibility that they were true, but it didn't overly affect you or anything to the point where you made a pledge to stay out of the woods or anything.
No, it didn't. It didn't affect me because I was outdoors a lot as a kid. Practically all summer long I would be gone playing in the woods with friends, going out and just being a kid, and it didn't bother me at that point. I guess maybe in the back of my mind I didn't truly believe everything that I heard, and I'm one of those people that had to see it to believe it. Fortunately or unfortunately, that was the case when I was 11 years old.
Yeah, I think that would definitely fit into the unfortunate category there. Now, being a kid, since a lot of kids are fascinated by the idea of monsters, hearing all this talk back then, it didn't necessarily affect you all that much, but were you fascinated with that topic of Bigfoot and other monsters in general, as people call them?
Yes, I've always been fascinated with things like that. When I was a kid, I was always big into, of course we didn't have a lot of them, but sci-fi movies and things like that, monster movies, and I've always been fascinated by Bigfoot or
Well, I can relate to that interest that you've had. I've always eaten that topic up like candy. Can't get enough of it. In the pre-interview, we talked about Atwood. I'm not really sure if Atwood is in southeastern Oklahoma or not, but you also mentioned that in the southeastern Oklahoma area, you had heard about quite a few sightings as well. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, the area where I grew up is about 40 miles to the northwest of the Kiamichi Mountains in Oklahoma. It's part of a larger range of mountains called the Ouachita Mountains. There have always been a lot of sightings in these mountains. They even had a couple shows filmed there. I think Bigfootville was filmed in the Kiamichi Mountains of Oklahoma. It's a very rugged terrain, lots of trees and very mountainous, which is probably why there's a lot of sightings of all kinds of creatures there. Mostly what I've heard is Bigfoot. There's a place there called Hanabi, Oklahoma, that's pretty famous for all the Sasquatch sightings. They even have a festival there every year.
Oh yeah, I don't think you could be into this for any period of time without hearing about Hanabi. From what you just said, you not only heard about Sasquatch encounters back then, but you also might have heard about Dogman encounters too?
Yes. Back then, the term Dogman wasn't used, and people were really reluctant to use the term werewolf. But they would talk about dog-faced creatures running on 4 legs and walking on 2 legs, things like that. They didn't use the term Dogman, of course, but yes, those definitely were what I believe to be Dogman sightings.
I'll tell you what, when you hear about encounters like that with dog-faced whatevers in the woods, I think that would keep me out of the woods as a kid. Maybe not for long, but for a while at least.
I was outdoors all the time. I've always loved the outdoors. I still do, but these days I don't go into the forest alone or at night, and try to stay away based on what I've seen. Although I do like to venture out occasionally and go out into the forest, but I'm always with protection or other people.
That's a good idea. That's a very good idea. Well, Mike, let's jump right into your encounter that you had. Please take us from leaving the house all the way through having the encounter to getting back home and the response that you got after getting back home and sharing what had happened. Please give us every detail that comes to mind.
Sure, no problem. It was July of 1972. I was 11 years old. I got up early that morning and went by some friend's house and met a few of them and suggested we go to this local swimming hole that was about a mile outside of town. So we gathered up a few more people. I think there were 5 of us in all, myself and 4 others. And we proceeded to leave town on the dirt road. There was only 2 roads that entered or left the town. We entered the road on the north side of town, or the south side of town, and walked. It was about a mile to the swimming hole. It was not much more than a hole in the ground, actually, but it was a spring-fed little reservoir that people like to go down every once in a while and just take a swim. It was cool, and it was awful hot in the summer, so it was a way to cool down. We started walking. It took us about 20 minutes to get there because we'd stop along the way and just do what kids do. And eventually we got to the pool and we took off our shoes. We already had shorts on and just jumped in, and we were probably swimming around in the thing, and for about, I would say, 15 to 20 minutes when I come up out of the water, and my 4 friends who were with me were running up the embankment to get on top of the bridge. They were all screaming and talking about something in the woods behind me, and I come up and I didn't know what was going on, and I turned around to look, and I saw something out of the corner of my eye that was black, very dark, moving from my right to the left. And as soon as I saw that, I jumped out of the swimming hole myself and ran up to the top of the bridge to get a look with everybody else. At first I couldn't see it, but then somebody pointed it out, and it was still moving in a semicircle, keeping its distance from us at about, I would say it's about 75 yards away. And this creature, like I said, it was moving from right to left, and it was on its hind legs. From the distance, it was quite a blur, but it looked like a dog that was running on its hind legs, slightly crouched over, and I would assume maybe 5 feet tall. So this creature ran from the right left for about 50 yards and stopped behind a row of bushes. Not a row, but a clump of bushes. So we're all sitting there staring at it, and about that time, the rest of my friends, I guess they lost their nerve. They weren't curious as much as they wanted to get out of there, so they all started running away, back up the hill towards town. Well, I continued to look because I just didn't know what it was. I thought, well, it's not a deer or a mountain lion. So I kept staring at the bushes where this thing was at. The bushes didn't cover it all the way up. You could see part of the creature, shoulder area, and the side. But then this creature decided to part the bushes with it, for lack of a better word, its hands, I guess, and was just very intent on studying me as much as I was studying it. So we locked eyes for about 10 or 15 seconds, I guess, and then I realized I was looking at something that I didn't believe should be on this earth. It was a very creepy experience, and all of a sudden the adrenaline rushed up into my head, I guess, and I started to freak out myself. And I did something that I probably shouldn't have done, because listening to your broadcast in the past, one of the things you're not supposed to do is to run away. It gives the predator the instinctive urge to attack. But I didn't know what else to do. I'm only 11 years old, so I just took off. But before I took off, I was able to get a good look at the creature's face. It was just like a large dog or a wolf, except bigger, and had very pointed ears that stuck straight up. And when this thing was looking at me, its jaws were partially open, and it was panting as if it was tired. I think it had run quite a way, and in my opinion, it was curious about us enough to want to observe us, but it was doing its best to stay out of our view. And the fur was a deep, dark black, almost like you would think of a black hole that doesn't allow light to escape. This thing was the blackest black I've ever seen in my life. I didn't really get a good view of its eyes. I could see where the eyes were, and I could see it was looking at me. But at 75 yards, you can't see a whole lot of detail. So anyway, this scared me so bad that I took off running myself. And all of us kids were so terrified that we left our sneakers or tennis shoes down at the swimming hole. We didn't even go back to get them. So we're all running up the hill. I'm a little bit behind the rest of them, but I caught up quick because I was fast. And eventually we made our way back into town and went over to a friend's house where his father was working outside in the front yard, working on his vehicle. And we were all trying to tell him about it, saying we'd seen a monster in the woods, and we wanted to go back and get our tennis shoes, and he said, well, you're going to have to go back and get them yourself. He didn't believe us that we'd seen anything. It's pretty typical of the adults back in that day and age. They were kind of no-nonsense, and they didn't believe anything unless they saw it for themselves. Sometimes I think they might have even seen something and still denied it, just for the sake of their own, I don't know, sanity. But anyway, we finally convinced him to take us back, and he drove all 5 of us back in his truck. And we got out and looked around the area first. We didn't see any evidence of anything, and we went down and recovered our shoes. And we left. He took us back home. The strange thing about all of this is that none of us ever spoke to each other about the encounter ever again. I don't know, it was almost like it was taboo. I think I was willing to talk about it, but I think everyone else was a little bit afraid that they'd be ridiculed, or were also told by their parents to never speak about something like that again. And so that's the basic part of my encounter.
You know, Mike, it might seem surprising that after having something like that was so extraordinary happen to you, the five of you, I guess it's not all that surprising that you never did speak about it again amongst yourselves. As you know, everyone's got a compensation device. They deal with things like that in a different way. Everyone's got their own best way to handle that. And for the other kids in the group, it just sounds like they were the type of people that coped better if they just tried to erase it from their memory and never relived it again. I can't fault them for that. But as far as the color that you mentioned goes, that blacker than black, that's a very commonly reported feature of these things. When they're seen in the sunlight, it's almost as if the sunlight is just soaked up by their fur, and it's like a black hole that the light disappears into. So that's not surprising at all that you reported seeing one like that. You said that when you first saw this dog man, it was on the other side of the water there. Before it started running, you said from right to left about maybe 50-ish to 60 yards or so before it hid behind that bush. When you first saw it there, was it in the wide open where you could get a full view from head to toe?
It was in a more open space than when it finally came to rest behind the bush. You could see anything from about 1.5 feet above the ground all the way to its head. And yes, it did get a clearer view. We had a much clearer view when it was running, but it was running so fast. I've never seen anything move so fast in the woods. A lot of times, deer or another animal will run, but they're always having to go around something, or, their footing is not sure. This thing, the speed in which it ran from the right to the left, it covered about 50 to 60 yards in a matter of no time at all. It was moving so fast that while it was moving, you could see it, but it was hard to, there were shadows as well. There were shadows and spots and areas of light. So this creature was running from right to left, and it was moving into shadows and out of shadows rather quickly. So it was kind of hard to get a really good look at it. But what I could see was that it was hunched over. It was approximately 5 foot tall, and the arms of the creature were, this is what was amazing, it looked like a dog almost in every aspect, but it had arms rather than just legs. They didn't behave like the dog's legs would behave. They were more like a person's arms. They were at the side, and they were moving, and as far as the back legs, I didn't get a glimpse of the typical, how the dogs have the inverted knee that starts about a third of the way up their leg. I wasn't able to see what kind of legs it had on the back, or its hind feet. But it was running on 2 feet with its arms slightly outstretched, 5 foot tall, and moving extremely fast.
If it had somewhat human-like arms, did you get a chance to see when it parted the bush if it had paws? I think you might have mentioned that it looked like paws, but I'm not sure. Did it have paws, or did it have what looked more like hands with claws on the ends of the fingertips?
Looked to me more like hands with claws.
Okay.
So especially the way it used its hands. You know how when a human being tries to part something with their hands, they have their palms faced outward? This thing acted like a typical person would. Somebody was trying to look and peer outside of some bushes. It used the palms of its hands, for lack of a better word.
That makes sense.
With fairly long claws on the end, from what I could tell.
I know that wasn't very comforting to see those long claws when you were looking at this thing, was it?
No, not at all. Once I realized what I was looking at, I think the first 5 to 10 seconds I was looking at it from behind the bush. I was kind of disbelieving what I saw. It didn't make sense to me. I was trying to look at it long enough so I could figure out exactly what it was. For some reason, I thought, I guess it didn't register, but after about 10 seconds of looking at this thing and it just staring at me, I got a very strong urge to leave right away because I felt that I was in danger at that time.
Oh, that only makes good sense. It's easy, knowing what you know about dogmen now, to come to the conclusion that that was most likely a juvenile, but back then, being 11, looking at this thing, did anything that you saw that day make you think, okay, this must be a juvenile, or did you only think, uh-oh, monster?
I think at the very first I just thought monster. It was big enough to where it would have been able to probably do anything to any one of us, hurt us in any way. But I didn't really come to the conclusion that it was a juvenile until, I guess, a little after, maybe a day or two or longer, because of the way I just got the sense that it was very curious about us as much as we were about it. And I got the feeling that it had seen people before and it was just looking to, out of curiosity, just like any kid would do, go searching, or if it sees somebody, then it does its best to observe and watch. But it knew we were watching it at one point, I believe. I think at first it didn't believe that we'd seen it, but it had to have heard all the screams and shouts and so on. But I think later is when I came to the conclusion that it was a juvenile, because it just seemed young to me, and it's nothing else that I could say about that. But now, as I look back and I hear of the stories about how large these things can get, I'm almost sure that it must have been a juvenile.
Oh, I'm sure you're right. I'm almost positive it was. Thank goodness it decided to head over towards that bush instead of coming after you. When you broke that water and were heading up the bank to get up to that bridge that crossed over the creek there, were you under the impression at that time that this thing was coming after you, or did it seem like maybe it wasn't? You had a pretty good idea that it wasn't coming after you.
I didn't know for sure, but I wasn't going to take any chances and assume that it was staying put. But I did have the distinct fear that, it could run up behind me and attack me from behind. But I did have the advantage of all my friends being up at a higher vantage point. They were screaming for me to hurry up, to get up on top, get up to the top of the bridge, but they didn't indicate that it was on my heels chasing me, so I wasn't deathly afraid at that point, but I was definitely in a big hurry to get out of the pool and at least join my friends on top of the bridge.
Oh, I can understand that. At the time, were you upset at your friends for leaving you like that, or what?
Yeah, I was the oldest one of them, only by a year or so, maybe 2 at the most. So I kind of understood, when you're that age and you're 2 years older than the rest, you're viewed as being kind of a leader. And I got on a couple of people and said, why didn't you stay? But I realized that they were very scared as well. But I think they were trying to get me to just join them and running as fast as they could. But I think I was spellbound by looking at this thing.
Yeah, that does make sense when you see something like that just can't exist. For almost anyone, I think there is going to be that period of time where you just try to gather in all the information that you can before the terror really sets in, and you try to pick them up and put them down to get out of there. So that does make sense. That's not all that surprising. Now, when all this was going on, Mike, did the thought that dog man might not have been alone ever cross your mind?
Yes. Probably about the same time I realized I was looking at something that shouldn't exist, in my opinion. I thought it's the distinct possibility that there were more than one of these around, and being a juvenile, the parents of this thing were probably in the vicinity as well, which wasn't comforting at all. Because if this was a juvenile, and it was 5 feet tall, or somewhere thereabouts, the parents of this thing had to be much larger. And that's something that I didn't even want to have to deal with.
That's understandable. Yeah, they do get quite a bit bigger than that, unfortunately. Now, when you all rode back in the truck to get your shoes and everything and looked around like you said you did you say that you did or did not notice any footprints in the area where you'd seen this thing? Or since it was across the creek there, did you not even go over to look for any?
No, we didn't look for any tracks. First, because we were still scared. When we did pick up our shoes, we looked in the immediate vicinity of the swimming hole for some kind of evidence that it might have tried to follow us as we were running away. There were no prints in the mud or in the area. Also, the area that it was running in was mostly open field, but it was heavy grass. So I don't know if we would have been able to find any footprints if we looked.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't have been able to. Not exactly a footprint trap, to say the least. Now, since this thing was so far away from you, Mike, when this all happened, you probably didn't get a chance to notice any details about its eyes, did you?
Not much about its eyes. When it was staring at me and I was staring at it, I could see the eyes, and they blinked once or twice. But I couldn't tell what color the eyes might be. But they were kind of set on the side of the face more so than the front. Most dogs that I've seen, their eyes are usually in the front, but this one had eyes that were a little farther back on its head. That was a big difference in the face that I could notice.
You know what? It's really interesting that you mentioned that, Mike, because this is the third instance that I know of someone seeing a dog man with what would appear to be monocular vision instead of binocular vision that a dog would have, like you just mentioned. Kirk Stokes mentioned seeing one in 1991 on episode 17 of the show. There was also a couple in the suburbs of Dallas that was coming home late one night from seeing a friend play in a band that saw a dog man with eyes on the side of its head like that. In other words, monocular vision. So that's interesting that you mentioned that. This is the first that I knew of that as far as your encounter goes. Moving forward, after this all happened, one day when you were going down the road in a car with your sister, you had another encounter. Please tell us about what happened that day.
I was probably 3 or 4 years later. We were driving to another town that was about 25 miles away, and we were crossing the South Canadian River at a bridge near Calvin, Oklahoma, which is about 12 miles from the place where we had our encounter. This wasn't a dog man, it was a Sasquatch, and I would say this is a sighting. It's not so much an encounter because we were up on a large bridge looking down. I really didn't see it first, my sister did, and she said, "Do you see that?" And she stopped the car on the bridge and pointed, and it was this Bigfoot walking across the sandy bottom of the river, and it was probably, an hour or 2 hours before dusk, and it looked almost exactly the same type of creature as in the Patterson-Gimlin film. Very large, but I think this is a male. I didn't see anything that would indicate it was female. Very muscular. We were looking down on it, so it's hard to judge the height, but I would say this thing had to be 7 or 8 feet tall. Very, very husky and large, well-developed. And it was walking away from us at about a 45-degree angle, so I could see the side of its face, but it never looked back to see if anybody was watching it, or it didn't look back towards us. It just continued on its path, and seemed to be in a relatively big hurry as well. This river is about 300 feet wide at that point where we saw this creature, and the Sasquatch was in the middle of the river, sandy bottom at this time because we were in the summer, so there was a lot of sandbars. This creature so it disappeared.
So when you're 11, you have a dogman encounter. And then now you're going down the road with your sister and you see this Sasquatch down below crossing the river. You had to be really wondering what in the world was going on at this point.
Absolutely. These things only happened a few years apart. You know, most people don't see things like this in their entire lives. Here I go as a young kid seeing these things twice or seeing two different things, both cryptids within a span of just a few years. It makes one wonder. Of course, I've never actually seen either of these creatures since that time. I've had feelings when I've been out in the woods with people before that I've been watched and sensed that something's nearby. But I haven't seen any of these, either one of the Sasquatch or Dogman since that time.
After you've had your encounters, or more specifically, after you had that encounter with the Dogman when you were 11, did you ever suffer any lingering negative effects, such as nightmares or PTSD?
No PTSD, but I did have nightmares for almost up to a year after that. The most lingering effect that I can say is the fear of the woods and fear of the darkness even more in the woods. I will not go alone into any woods, not even ones that are not that far from civilization, I guess you could say, because I just have a fear about running into one of these things again. And the Bigfoot sighting was not traumatic at all, of course. It's the Dogman that really disturbs me, because it just seems so unreal that something like this can exist. And they're also, from what I've heard, they can be quite vicious. Of course, I didn't know at the time, but still nerving to know that something like that's out there. But the most lasting effect would be that I don't venture much into the woods these days, unless I'm with other people, and it's usually not very far. Or I have some kind of weapon on me, and it would have to be a gun or something like that, large caliber.
Well, after seeing something like that, especially at such a young age, I don't think anyone could blame you for being reluctant to head into the woods when you know that something like that is out there. All the doubt has been taken out of your mind now that you've seen one. So, like I said, I don't think anyone can fault you on that whatsoever. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to share, Mike?
No, just if anybody's out and about in the woods and places, just keep a wary eye out. You never know what's out there. And these things, in my opinion, can be very dangerous. And I think people need to be very careful. And also, I really appreciate your show. I think you're doing a great job of bringing this out into the public domain and helping people to recognize that these things do exist.
Well, thanks for the good words. Thanks for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, you're most welcome, Dick. It was my pleasure.
Well, it's great to have you. You know, I'm always here if you ever need to talk about anything. As you know, please don't be a stranger, okay?
I'll not be a stranger. Thanks a lot, Vic.
I appreciate it. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. If you've had a Dogman encounter and you want to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, you can reach me at contact@dogmanencounters.com. I'd love to hear from you.